We're going to be in Daniel chapter number 3. We're in week number 3 of our series, Stand and Be Different Because You Are Different. Chapter number 3 is the fiery furnace, and you went to Sunday school or any kind of children's Bible class, you've probably heard the story through the years, but I guarantee you God's going to show you something different today. So go to Daniel chapter number 3. As you're going there this morning, would like for all of you to, in your bulletin there, it's going to be the OCC kickoff meeting. It's going to be at Pinecrest Tuesday, this coming Tuesday at 7 o'clock. It's kind of like a kickoff worship service. That's actually where they found out about that group that came last year. So if any of you would like to attend that, it will be at Pinecrest Baptist Church as we kick off our shoebox year. Getting ready for all that to come. This morning is going to be kind of like last week. I can't read you all those verses in chapter number 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to paraphrase the best I can each little section. I'm going to point out the most critical verses, and we'll read those as we go through the story. This morning, I want to talk to you about standing firm in your faith. We've talked the first 2 weeks about just standing and shining, standing and just showing the world who you belong to. And most of what happened in chapter number 1 and 2 happened as they just did what was right in the sight of God. And sure, they had to take a stand, but when they did take a stand, they didn't make these big public protests. They did it in the right way at the right time, at the right moment. And because of that, God honored them, and God kept elevating them higher and higher. Now, the key statement that I really pounded the first 2 weeks, and I'm going to mention it here in the opening again this week, that kind of ties everything together about you and I being different and standing out and being different. The statement is we need to know who we are. Now, I hope you know who you are. Not know who you are by your name, but know who you are. And I've said this over and over, that you are a born-again child of God who's been washed in the blood of Jesus Christ. You've been bathed in the grace and goodness of God, and you've been clothed in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. Stand and be different because you are different. You are so much different than all of the sinners that are living out there that have never experienced that grace and that favor that you have experienced. And God has put you where He has put you. And He's given you a platform, whether it's on the ball fields in Little League, whether it's being a teacher at a school, whether it's being in your community, in your family. God has given you that platform in the midst of people all around you that have no hope, they have no direction because they have no Jesus. And you have Jesus. You've got Him in your heart. And you need to know who you are. You need to know who you are to the core. And you need to stand and you need to be that person. You need to carry yourself different. You need to react different. You need to speak different. Your approach needs to be different in everything and in every way. When somebody else looks at you on the platform of ministry that God has given you, you and I should be different. You've been chosen, selected, and placed exactly where you are. You know what? Daniel and his 3 buddies were taken from their homeland, and they were put right in the middle of the Babylonians, surrounded by pagan sinners. But you know what? Surrounded by pagan sinners, God gave them a platform to minister. And I'm sure you're surrounded by a lot out there in this world, wherever God has placed you. Might be difficult, might be hard. There might be people that just repel you because of the way they talk or the way they live or the way they treat you. But God has put you there to shine. He's put you there to stand. He's put you there to glow for Him. He's put you there to be different because you are different. To have faith, to have courage, to stand. This morning in Daniel chapter number 3, we're going to look at the testing of our faith. Kind of like what Abby was talking about. You know, when your faith is tested, other people see how you react to it. They see how you respond to it. And I mean, in the midst of adversity, you can learn everything you want to learn about somebody, because the true core of who that person is will come to the surface. This morning, we're going to look at this story. We're going to look at the fiery furnace. Now, there's going to be 3 phases in this story. 3 phases that are going on in your life continually. We're going to see what happened before the fire. We're going to see what happens in the fire. And we're going to see what happens after the fire. So before the fire, in the fire, and after the fire. So whatever you're facing this morning, maybe you're facing, you know, and everything that is going on in your life is, I mean, there are things going on in your life right now or around you that's coming your way that you're not even aware of right now. It's before the fire. And we're going to see what you should be doing before the fire. Because when the fire comes, if you have not done before what you should have done, you will not be any different than somebody in the world. You'll not be able to navigate through that fire and come through that fire and be stronger on the other side of that fire. And then after the fire, there will be no glory, praise, and honor that will be able to go to God, because we wasn't ready for it when it came our way. So point number 1, let's talk about the pre-show preparation. The pre-show preparation, because that's what God's about to do here in chapter number 3. He's about to put on a show. And it's going to be a God show. And it's going to be a God show to where He's going to use these 3 young men. Now, this pre-show preparation, verses 1 through 7, lets you know what is happening before the fire. And it lets you know what you and I should be doing, and exactly what was taking place here in these first 7 verses. Now, if you remember last week, if you were here, or if you just happened to read Daniel chapter number 2 last week, if you wasn't here, I'm sure you probably did, there was a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and he couldn't find anyone to interpret that dream. Well, Daniel learns about it, and he interprets the dream for Nebuchadnezzar. And you remember it was this, detailed dream. But the biggest part of the dream was the head. And you remember the head was actually Nebuchadnezzar, and it was made of gold, and that head was Nebuchadnezzar. Well, it didn't really say in chapter number 2, but you see in chapter number 3 that it really starts to get to Nebuchadnezzar. He gets this big ego. He gets this pride that's welling out. So what happens in chapter number 3, because of the big head that Nebuchadnezzar has here, that he's built this great Babylonian empire, and not realizing that God has given him the power to be able to have this big empire, he gets this big head. And he makes this big image of gold, this huge statue. Now, we've heard about the fiery furnace and that they were to bow to the statue, the image of gold, but we never really learned through Sunday school and different things just how big this thing was. This thing was 90 foot tall. 90 foot tall and 9 foot wide. Man, Nebuchadnezzar had a big head, didn't he? He makes this big, huge statue, and I'm sure that this golden image, this golden statue, somehow in some way resembled King Nebuchadnezzar. So he makes this huge thing. This image is constructed, and they're going to have a dedication service here in just a moment. But this thing was so big, as you're coming into Babylonian, you could see this thing from miles off. And what Nebuchadnezzar is about to introduce, and the test that these 3 young men are about to face, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel, Mishael, Azariah, because their names were changed, is they're about to be put to the test. Will you worship an idol and renounce the one and only true God. So we got the construction of the image, and then the king gives a command. And that command is that when you hear all these different types of music and they begin to play, the command is that, as we sung a minute ago, they were to fall down, they were to bow down to the ground, and they were to worship this golden image at the moment that they heard the music. Now, the consequences of not worshiping this image was clearly laid out. So in other words, you could worship and you could bow, or today was going to be the day that you were going to die hard today. You were going in that fiery furnace. If it was reported to the king that anybody did not bow and worship this golden image, you were going into the fiery furnace. Well, verse number 7 says the music starts. And when the music starts, everybody falls to the ground, they bow down, and they begin to worship. Or did everybody do it, or were there some that didn't do it? Well, verses 8 through 12, in your text there, if you want to read it, he's putting it on behind us, verses 8 through 12. People saw the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't worship. They didn't bow. Everybody else heard the music and they fell to the ground and they worshiped. But these three young men didn't fall to the ground and worship. Now, you remember the last 2 weeks, Daniel and these three men, because of the favor that God had on their life, kept rising in the Babylonian Empire. They had the favor of God on them and they kept getting promoted, and King Nebuchadnezzar was giving them higher positions. So I'm sure there was a lot of jealousy. So when they saw that these three men didn't bow down, immediately they go, verses 8 through 12, they go and they bring word back to the king. They make these charges to the king. King, you made this command, you made this decree that everybody was to fall down and worship, but I want you to know there are three in particular who are not bowing down, king. They're disregarding you. They're disregarding your word. They're disrespecting you, and they are being disloyal to you. Man, I'm sure they were laying it on thick. I mean, we know how to lay it on good, don't we? I mean, when we're talking about somebody else, we know how to lay it on good. And that's exactly what these guys were doing, because what they were doing was they were trying to cut the feet out from underneath these three young men. Now, what we're going to do as we go through this story, I got to stop and I got to pause right here, because you and I also could be before the fire right now. John 16:33 says, in this world we're going to what? We're going to have tribulation. We're going to have trials. We're going to go through the fire. There's going to be some fires we go through that are going to be difficult. I mean, losing a mate at 25 when he was only 28, losing, as Greg, a daughter, losing a mom, a dad, a brother. I mean, we're going to go through financial collapses and different things here on this earth. We're going to go through different fires. But Jesus said, be of good cheer. I have overcome the world, and you're going to be able to overcome the world too. If you'll take your stand and be different and rely on me and look to me, I've overcome it, and you're going to be able to overcome it too. But there's some preparations that we need to make before the fire, so that when the fire does get here, when the moment of testing comes, we are ready for the fire. Not that we're excited about it. Man, I sure am glad that I'm ready for this difficult thing that God has allowed to come my way. But if we're not, it will be a total, absolute disaster on top of how hard it already is. So the pre-show preparations before the fire in your life and in my life is that we got to focus on this inner man. We got to feed the inner man. We got to nurture the inner man. I mean, the inner man's got to feed on the Word of God. You got to fill your mind with the Word of God. You've got to strengthen your spirit and strengthen your soul, so that when the moment of testing comes, you can look to the one who has already overcome the world and know that through him you can have the strength to be able to overcome the difficult trial and fire that has been placed before you. Preparations are always being made. And you know what? If you slip on making preparations, on being prepared and being ready, you will probably more than likely fail the test when the test comes. So in the pre-show preparations, we need to make sure that the inner man, the spiritual man, is being fed, nurtured, and strengthened. That's one thing about Daniel and these three young men that they were doing. They were seeking their God. They were looking to their God. They were dependent on their God. They were connected to their God so that when opposition came their way, they were ready for it. They were sensitive to the voice of God. They knew when to stand boldly and they knew when to stand quietly because they were in tune with what God was up to all around them. Number two, not only pre-show preparation, but let's look at the live show presentation. Verse number 13. Let me read this one. Let's read verse number 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. So man, the king is mad. Now, the last thing you want to do is upset the king. I don't care who the king is. Because all through the Old Testament, when you upset the king and made the king mad, you were executed and you died. So last thing you want to do is upset the king. So these three young men are brought before King Nebuchadnezzar, and he asks them there in verse number 14. He says, young men, is it true? I mean, because I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar was in disbelief. I mean, out of all the people that he thought might dishonor him, he didn't think these three young men would dishonor him and dishonor his word. So he says, is it true what I'm hearing, that you don't serve my gods and you're not worshiping this image? And notice what he says in verse number 14, that you do not worship the image that I have set up. You don't worship the image that I have created. Now, remember, I may have not said this in the first 2 weeks, but Babylon in the Old Testament is a picture of the world in the New Testament. So here they are in Babylon, it's a picture of the world. Now, you and I know that Jesus said in the New Testament that we're in the world, but we're not of the world. So you're in it, and by being in it, that's your platform, but you're not of the world. So in other words, stand and be different because you are different. You're in this world, and all around you is sin. All around you is philosophies and all kind of ways of living that is anti-God. All kind of ways to try to get you to what? To conform to the world's mode, to fit in, to blend in, to be like everybody else. That's exactly what was happening right here in Daniel chapter number 3. Babylon, a picture of the world, was trying to reshape them and remold them to get them to compromise their character, compromise their conviction, and compromise their choices. I mean, just look around. Even in their world, same way in our world. They had 3 main pressures. First of all, they had political pressure. Do we not have that in our world today? Man, we got political. I mean, how many times have you heard people say today that you're number 3, you would have just glanced right over this and you would have never noticed. Notice that they did not make a public protest. It became public, but in the beginning, they did not stand in the street with their banners. They did not stand in front of the statue with their banners and say, "We will not bow. We will not do this because blankety, 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 blank." You know what? If they would have made a public protest, and just about everybody that makes public protests like that, guess what? They become what? They become the center of attention, not God. They didn't make a public protest. You know what they did? They just did what was right. They just took the platform that God gave them and they just did what was right. And by doing what was right, by standing and being different, quietly, not speaking a word, it was noticed. And because it was noticed, it became public. And because it became public, God's way, God became the center of attention, and God got the glory, and God gave them His powerful presence to deal with the public outcry that came their way. So, point number 8, I've already said it. They were standing in silence. If you're ever wondering, most of your standing, now I'm not saying don't be a witness, and I'm not saying tell people about Jesus. We don't want to tell people about Jesus. We want to tell people about our soapbox issues. Now, we don't want to talk about Jesus. Man, Jesus died on the cross for your sins. He gave His life for you. He's provided you with the gift of grace. All you got to do is come to Him and confess your sin. We don't want to talk about Jesus. We want to talk about our soapbox issues and tie Jesus to it. That's the reason why this world hates Christians, is because we don't necessarily even get out there and portray Jesus like we should. We want to portray our issues and our agenda. So if you're ever wondering, when it comes to those things, you should stand in silence probably the majority of the time when it's those soapbox issues. Don't go on Facebook and tell somebody what you think about a hot topic unless God so awakens you during the night and prods you in your spirit for you to do it. Because most of the time when you do that, it will turn out to be completely, totally divisive. And God is not in division, He's in you. I'm not saying that we don't ever speak up. I'm not saying we don't speak the truth. But you know it as well as I know it. People can't see the intent and motives of the heart behind a computer or behind an iPhone. They read into it what they want to read into it. And man, that's how we want to tell people about Jesus today. Behind the iPhone. Talking about our soapbox. But I can put something on my Facebook about Jesus, tie it to the Lighthouse page, and very few people, even in this congregation, will respond to it. Because we don't even know how to respond to this Jesus thing. Standing in silence. Second of all, now notice what Nebuchadnezzar does here. Verse number 15, they're standing in silence. Verse number 15, Nebuchadnezzar says, let's try this again. Let's try this again. I'm just afraid you boys didn't quite get this. Let me give you one more chance, boys, to get this right. And then in the latter part of verse number 15, 15d, he says, and what God can deliver you out of my hands? Boy, that's a loaded statement right there. What God? You didn't get it right the first time. Let's try this again. Because what God out there can deliver you out of my hands? Now notice. Now it was time for them to, point number B here, standing and speaking. And they started speaking there in verse number 16. And basically what they said in verse 16, King, you know who we are. King, you know where we're from. You know what we are about. And King, you know that we cannot do what you have asked us to do. We know we are not going to get our worship on today for you, King. It's not going to happen. Because if we get our worship on for you today, King, that means we got to renounce the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And you know who we are, and you know what we are about, and you know that we can't do this. But we want you to know, King Nebuchadnezzar, it's okay, because our God has got this. Our God is able. He is able to what? He is able to deliver us. He is able to deliver us from the fire. He is able to deliver us from you, and He will deliver us from you. But if He don't, let it be known to you right now, King, you've given us another chance. We appreciate you giving us another chance. But don't worry about playing the music. Don't waste your time, because we are not bowing down. Period. End of story. Go ahead and do what you need to do, King. Because even if it is God's will for us to go in that fire and die right here today, we will die before we bow to your image. They did two things here. They spoke truth and faith, number one. Man, their faith was rooted in God. Our God is able to deliver us. He will deliver us from this fire. He will deliver us from you. But you know what? These three young men prayed, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." Did you notice? They said, our God is able. He will deliver us. So they had faith rooted in, they wanted God's will to be that He would deliver them from that fire and He would deliver them from the king. But they also realized, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, that all the time, a lot of times, our will is not going to line up with God's will. What we wanted is not going to be what God gave us. And these three young men realized that God, even if we have to die in that fire, your will be done. Because we know you got us, and we know you got a plan, and we know you got a purpose. And we might not understand it, but we know that you are sovereign and you are absolutely in complete control. They spoke the truth in faith, and they spoke truth without fear. They're speaking to the king. They're facing the king. They're telling the king, "King, skip the music." No sense in playing that music, because these three boys are not going to bow down to that image today. The reason why they said they wasn't going to bow down to that image is because this decision was the right decision. You know, Daniel's written, they already had the 10 Commandments. And you know, as well as I know, those first 4 commandments deal with your relationship with God. Not having any other gods before you, not worshiping any idols. They already knew that the whole reason why King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came in and overtook their city was because their people from their homeland were serving other gods and serving idols. It was already rooted in them. They had already seen with their eyes where that would get you. And they said, no, not us. We're going to love the Lord our God. We're going to love Him, and we're going to worship Him. Because I'm telling you, when you go out those doors, the question every day will be, who and what will you worship? That's the question every day. That's the question every day. When you go out there in this world, who will you worship and what will you worship? And it says Jesus is to be at a level in your life so exclusive that nobody else can penetrate that box. Nothing out here in this world can make you fit in, conform, and shape to their mode and get you to compromise what you know about this great God and what He's done for you. If He's done nothing else, as our sister said a minute ago, but washed you in the blood and bathed you in His grace and goodness and clothed you in His righteousness, that is enough in and of itself to say nothing else is coming into this area of my life. I'm God's, and I belong completely to Him. Verse number 19 says the king was filled with rage and anger, and his face towards these men changed to the point to where he said, heat up that furnace 7 times hotter. And then he said, tie them up. And then he said, throw them in. Man, this is live action. Live action on display. Live action on display to where God takes center stage in the life of these boys. These boys are not on the center of the stage. God is on the center of the stage with the boys. The boys are there. They get a front row seat. They get to see this great God work in their life. This great God is fixing to work in the king's life. It's not about them, it's all about God. But because of their faithfulness and their fearlessness, God gave them the front row seat to be able to experience Him and see Him in a way that very few people will ever see Him in this world. Verse number 23 says that fire was so hot that those that tossed these 3 young men into it were immediately consumed and they died. In the latter part of verse number 23 there, it says, and the boys fell into the fire, and then notice what it says. They fell into the fire and they were what? Still tied up. Now, before they go in, they're tied up and bound. And even after they first initially go in, they're tied up and bound. And then if you'll notice also, that up until this point of them going into the fire, they've spoke about God. They've talked about God and how they won't do this and that their God was able. But there had been no visual sighting of God whatsoever. There had been no verbal word from God whatsoever. So these 3 men truly were walking by faith. They were standing on the Word of God as they knew it. They didn't need any sight from God other than His Word. And they stood on His Word, and they did not demand for God to give them sight to be able to walk by. They just stood on His Word, and they believed God. Now notice verse 24 and 25. The king all of a sudden becomes astonished. And he asks 2 questions. He says, wasn't there 3? And they said, yes, king. Wasn't they bound? Yes, king. And then I could just see Nebuchadnezzar, and I don't know how he reacted, but I could just see before verse number 25 comes along that he's saying, okay, you said there were 3, and you said they were bound. But he says, look. He says, look in there. Verse 25, he says, I see 4. I see 4, and I see 4 walking around. They're not tied up anymore. Not only do I see 4, I see they don't have the ropes on them anymore. And it looks like to me that the 4th one is the Son of the Most High God. Now get this, don't miss this. They were, I don't even know if this is a word, but I'm going to use it. They were freer in the fire than they were outside of the fire. They were closer to God in the fire than they were outside the fire. So notice what happens. Because they stood on faith and they had courage to do what God said and they believed that God was able, they were loosed and they were bound, they were loosed, so they were freer. Freer because when Christ sets you free, you're free indeed. I mean, all chains are broke. Every one of them. He severs, and He sets you free to be completely freed in Him. And you're closer to God in the fire. Notice verse number 26. The king comes near, he looks up in the fire, and he tells these boys, he says, you boys come out of there. And notice how he addresses them. You are servants of the Most High God. Come out of that fire. So we got before the fire, preparation. We got in the fire, the presentation. Now I want you to look third of all, as we close here, the after show proclamation. The after show, where some things are going to be proclaimed here. And these things cannot be proclaimed if these three young men are not prepared before the fire, if they do not make the proper presentation inside of the fire. These proclamations would never be made. But here we are, right in the middle of the Babylonian Empire, right in the midst, surrounded by all these pagan sinners, worshiping all these false gods, all this opposition, all these struggles. Here are three young men who stood with conviction, stood with character, chose to do the right thing at the right moment, in the right way, at the right time. And because they did that, there's some things that are going to be proclaimed here. Notice, first of all, that everyone gathered around with wow. I mean, wow is just like, man, I don't know what to say. Wow, I mean, they were absolutely, completely amazed. I mean, the king, and I'm sure all the high-ups were right there around him, and every one of them, I mean, they just witnessed somebody being thrown in the fire. And what amazed them so much, as you read there, they got thrown inside of this furnace. Nothing on them was burned, scorched, no hair, no nothing. They went in there bound up. They were loosed, they were set free, and they came out and had no effects of the fire upon them whatsoever. And I'm sure they stood there with their jaws wide open and could not believe what they were seeing. You know why? Because when you stand, because you're different, people will see God in your life, and they will see things through your life that God reveals to them that they would have never been able to see if it wasn't for your faithfulness. The impact it can have on their life, the change it can bring into their life. Wow. They gathered around as witnesses, second of all, as witnesses. What did they witness? They witnessed the power of God. They witnessed the presence of God. They saw God. They saw God through three young teenage boys, probably a little older now, maybe 18, 19, 20. By the time chapter 3 rolls around, they saw God in these young men. And they witnessed the power of God and the presence of God. When's the last time somebody saw God in your life? Just saw God in your life just because you were just being faithful. You were just doing the right thing. Wasn't going around self-proclaiming it. Wasn't going around trying to make yourself stand out. You were just doing the right thing, and because you did the right thing, we're to be faithful in all those categories. And when we are, we'll be prepared for whatever comes our way. We'll be able to present God in the right way. And we will be able to proclaim to this world that God is faithful and God is good, even when things happen in your life that you don't like. He's still good. He's still faithful. And it can be proclaimed to this world, and you can make a difference in somebody else's life. Let's stand by our heads.